Let me welcome you all to Working Rangelands Wednesdays, where we explore topics around rangeland agriculture in California and across the West. This is our second webinar in the series Managing Drought in 2022. And it's a follow-up on our original series that was hosted the summer of 2020, which also focused on drought management. All of those recordings are featured in our YouTube channel, and I'll post the link in the chat here in just a sec. My name is Dan Macon. I'm the Livestock and Natural Resources Advisor for Placer, Nevada, Sutter, and Yuba counties. Grace, I'll let you introduce yourself before I come back and introduce you more completely.
Okay, my name is Grace Woodmansee, and I'm the Livestock and Natural Resources Advisor for Siskiyou County Cooperative Extension.
And behind the curtain tonight, making sure all of the technical details get covered, we have Dr. Leslie Roach, who is the Cooperative Extension Specialist in Rangeland Science and Management. And we really appreciate you guys all making time to be here tonight. So as I mentioned, we are recording this webinar. It will be posted on our YouTube channel. If you are a live participant and have questions, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to type your questions. Leslie and I will be monitoring those as we go through and make sure that they get asked. Tonight's webinar is led by Grace Woodmansee, as I said, and for the last 5 years, Grace has worked in cooperative extension and is committed to conducting collaborative applied research to address management challenges on grazing lands. She's especially interested in multidisciplinary research and the role that it plays in solving complex issues. Her graduate work focused on drought adaptation and used rancher interviews to determine what management strategies were most effective in managing through historic drought conditions. Working with local ranchers up in Siskiyou County, she continues to develop drought management resources in her research and extension program. And with that, Grace, I will turn it over to you.
Great. Well, thank you for the intro, Dan. I'm happy to be here this evening with all of you to discuss drought planning and share the work I've been a part of as a grad student and now as an advisor in Siskiyou County. So as Dan mentioned, I completed my master's at UC Davis in December of 2020, and that work focused on drought adaptation for California ranchers. So I'll be sharing some of that research today, and then also talking a little bit about some decision-making tool or decision support tools that we developed based on that research. So Dan and Leslie were my advisors in grad school and are now colleagues. So it's great to continue working on this research as a new advisor. I also wanted to mention that in addition to Dan and Leslie, our colleague Tracy Shore also helped lead research efforts, and then I got involved as a student in analyzing data and working on some of the outreach info we've developed along the way. So just wanted to touch briefly on where we're heading today. So I'll provide a little bit of background information on the research that we've all been working on drought adaptation for California ranchers, and talk briefly about how that research helped inform our decision support tool, and then talk about the decision support tool specifically and walk through some of the features. So I'm sure all of you that are on today are very familiar with California rangelands and their importance, but I wanted to mention this just because our research did focus specifically on rangeland livestock producers. So rangelands are defined by their diversity, whether that be forage type or the activities that these multiple use landscapes support. They're uncultivated due to physical limitations like topography or soil quality or temperature, and instead are dominated by native and introduced grasses and also shrubs and trees. But of course, as we all know, they provide numerous environmental and social benefits, including clean water, wildlife habitat, open space, and forage for both wild and domestic grazers. And our state, California, is almost 60% rangeland and really showcases the fact that these landscapes are often at the nexus of wildland and urban landscapes. Also wanted to touch briefly on how we define drought, even though it's a little bit difficult, kind of a broad term, but drought is generally regarded as a climate water deficit that results in negative ecological, economic, and social impact. So the consequences of drought can definitely be far reaching. And the kind of drought we're talking about is different than a seasonal dry period. I feel like this question comes up a lot during the conversation of drought planning and drought in general in California. Is it getting worse? So drought is certainly nothing new to either ranchers or rangelands. Both have co-evolved with drought and have been shaped by drought and are adapted to survive drought. However, we do see that drought is increasing in severity and frequency and duration. So some of the work that's been done by the authors listed below on this slide suggests that these increasingly severe drought impacts we're experiencing can be attributed to kind of the interacting effects of our expected or normal short-term drought conditions with long-term soil moisture deficits that are driven by climate change. So I'll circle back to these mega drought conditions later on in the presentation, but just wanted to touch on it briefly before we get into the research. Also wanted to remind everyone of the 2012 to 2016 historic drought and what it looks like. These images are all from the Drought Monitor. And really the severity and duration of the 2012 to 2016 drought tested the ability of land managers to adapt under extraordinary conditions. So not just managing through an extreme water shortage or several years of low precipitation, but a combination of the two. And that combination, as you all know, really restricts resources, and often painful trade-offs have to be made in order to keep the ranch in operation. So the ability to manage through these types of extreme disturbances is tied to adaptive capacity. So we define adaptive capacity as the ability to respond to a disturbance, adjust, and learn through experience. And I think we can all relate to this in our own lives. It's not just something that's linked to ranching or to agriculture. Every new challenge we learn to live through increases our knowledge base and our toolkit of how to manage through the next challenge. So for ranchers trying to survive a drought, this involves managing both pressing threats, like a lack of forage resources, while protecting the long-term economic sustainability of the operation. So I wanted to provide just a little bit more information on how we research drought before getting into the results of our work. So drought management planning is incredibly complex, and of course it's unique to individual operations. So in order to research this and obtain information that's useful for both management and policy, we use the adaptive decision-making framework, which you can see on the right-hand side of your screen, to help kind of collect and categorize information. So this is helpful for research because we can ask questions that get at each one of the framework components. And then as extension advisors, we can eventually use that information to help develop resources. So these four categories or four components of the ADM framework are where research and extension efforts can be concentrated. We can't provide anyone with more drought experience, but we can share the experiences of others to help with decision making, and that's exactly what this work aims to do. So getting into the actual research. So the research I'll be discussing today is based on two separate but complementary efforts. So we had the 2011 surveys and a series of interviews that were conducted in 2016. So the goal of the surveys wasn't necessarily to study drought management in particular, but they did include a section about drought management practices, which ended up providing some really great baseline information about how ranchers were approaching drought management heading into the 2012 to 2016 historic drought. And then the 2016 interviews provided an opportunity to dig into the topic further and to look at what worked and what didn't work for operations based on their perspectives. So although these research efforts were meant to be complementary rather than paired, we did have similar questions posed between the two. So we'll be looking today at drought impacts, drought management strategies, and rancher perception of drought. So this is the demographic data from the 2011 surveys and the 2016 interviews. As you can see, we had pretty similar groups of ranchers that we were working with on average. Okay, so getting into the results of this research, specifically looking at drought impacts. So across the survey and interview respondents, the most severe impacts were related to the reduction of forage availability and the reduction of income. So I think that's no surprise to most of us to see that the most severe impacts across the board were related to reduced forage availability and increasing expenses. But I wanted to highlight the 2016 questions in particular. So we asked ranchers to reflect on both past droughts and the current 2012 to 2016 drought when they were answering this question. And as you can see, a large increase in reported impacts for the current drought. And in addition, the reported severity of those impacts also increased. So looking now at management strategies, both types of management strategies and also the number of management strategies that were used by the ranchers we surveyed and interviewed. So before getting into this slide too much, I wanted to define what we mean by proactive and reactive drought management decisions. So a proactive management decision is something that's deployed before the start of a drought with the intention of reducing expected drought impacts, whereas a reactive strategy is something that's deployed during a drought as it's taking place to reduce impacts during that time. So the types of management strategies appear to be consistent across the 2011 surveys and the 2016 interviews, but the number of drought management practices used per operation seemed to increase between 2011 and 2016, particularly for proactive strategies. So getting into the proactive strategies a bit more here, we'll look at the types. So starting with reactive strategies, I'll just orient you to these graphs real quick. Along the y-axis, we have the percent use of our interview and survey respondents, and the x-axis has the type of strategy that in particular. So this graph that's currently on the screen is the reactive drought practices used by study participants. 2016 is represented in blue and 2011 is represented in orange. So you can see here that we had the same top 4 reactive practices reported by both groups, just different percentages of ranchers that were using them. And then here are the proactive drought practices used by our study participants. So they were similar. The top 4 proactive strategies were similar across the board. You'll notice though that the individual practice adoption increased substantially. So for example, when you look at pasture rest, in 2011, surveyed ranchers, 23% of surveyed ranchers reported using pasture rest as a proactive drought management strategy. But in 2016, 92% of interviewed ranchers reported using it as a proactive management strategy. So looking now at the number of strategies, the total number of strategies that were used by each operation, we saw an increase in the total number of strategies used by ranchers. So 64% of those surveyed in 2011 were using a proactive management strategy, whereas 98% of our interviewed ranchers were using at least one and many more than one proactive practice. 99% of survey respondents were using at least one management strategy to respond to drought, whereas 98% of interviewed ranchers were using at least 3 practices to respond to drought, or reactive practices. So combining what we saw on the last slide with this slide, there was an apparent increase in both proactive practice use and individual practice adoption, like we saw with the grass banking example. So what could be causing that? One explanation is that underlying drought conditions leading into 2012, so those mega drought conditions I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, might have been a catalyst for proactive drought planning. And we saw evidence of this kind of continued or enhanced proactive drought planning in the quotes from some of our interviewees. So the interviewed ranchers in 2016 said things like, "We expect drought every year now. I'm not sure I'd really call it a drought plan. It's just our normal way of ranching now. My management always takes drought into account. And drought will be more influential in our future operation plans because we know now how to prepare better." So looking now at drought perception. So these 2 questions were asked in 2011 and repeated in 2016. So kind of an interesting comparison here of how perspectives were shaped by managing through the 2012 through 2016 drought. So our questions are, will drought be more influential in management planning in the next 10 years? In 2011, the majority of surveyed ranchers said no. And in 2016, the majority of interviewed ranchers said yes. And then looking at our second question, if another drought were to begin right now, how severely would this impact the economic viability of your operation? 2011 survey respondents said as severely or worse. And the 2016 interviewees said less severe. So essentially, in 2016, at the end of the historic drought, ranch managers believed that drought would be more influential in their future management planning, but also that their current management strategies would be adequate to mitigate future drought impacts. So that seemed a little bit contradictory, but one explanation might be that this outcome is a combination of feeling more prepared to manage through a severe multi-year drought conditions because of their increased management capacity and experience, but also a perception that the 2012 to 2016 drought was so severe, it was difficult to imagine worse conditions. So I'll bring up our orange quotes that you already saw when we were discussing the increase in proactive practice adoption. But I also want to highlight these red quotes, which really capture how difficult and emotionally distressing managing through the 2012 to 2016 drought was for the ranchers that we interviewed. So they said things like, "I fed hay every day for 14 months. I'm mentally and physically tired. If another drought were to start right now, then we would probably sell out. The stress would be too much. And even I will be scarred by this experience." So focusing on our take-home message at the ranch level as we move into a discussion of the decision support tool. Just keep in mind that having a written drought management plan in place, we found that that was very important, and that also having a portfolio of both proactive and reactive strategies is very important because it provides flexibility in managing through drought. So heading now into our discussion of the decision support tool. I wanted to start by looking briefly at what our current drought conditions are in California. So basically, after a few wet years after 2016, we entered a drought again in 2020 in most parts of the state. So I started in the middle of this kind of new historic drought in January of 2021, and was noticing that a lot of the drought management tools for ranchers were developed in other Western states, but not as much for California ranchers. And differences in our forage resources and our production systems create a unique ranching environment in California. So that was part of the kind of the inspiration in creating this drought management tool, was to make it a little bit more tailored to the unique needs of California producers. Especially since it really seems like timing, almost more than quantity of precipitation, sometimes makes a difference in our California rangeland systems, especially in the annual grasslands. So we wondered if our research could provide a jumping off point for a tool that was detailed enough to be useful, but open-ended enough to take all of those California specific variables into account. So Dan, Macon, and I collaborated this past summer to develop the first draft of this decision support tool. And the first thing I want to say before getting into kind of the structure of the tool itself is that there is no right way to plan for drought. It's really up to the individual, because nothing can replace the insights and experience and ranch specific data that individual operators have. So that's why we call this a decision support tool and not a drought management tool or drought management plan per se. So thinking back to our ranch level takeaways, having a written drought management plan was really important, and only 50% of the ranchers we interviewed had one in place going into the 2012 drought. So our goal here, in addition to providing a template to put together a written drought plan for your operation, is just to provide a starting point. This could be used as a worksheet for yourself, as a conversation starter with family or your management team, or even just an opportunity to consider or revisit some of the questions that are posed later on in the I guess the structure of the tool. So our goal here is that this tool will evolve over time based on feedback from California ranchers. So hopefully it's never really done. And my goal today is just to present basically a starting point for conversation, but not the final draft of this tool for sure. We welcome feedback on the decision support tool and really want it to be as applied and useful as possible. So if by the end of the presentation today, you have some thoughts on how it could be improved or other feedback, please feel free to reach out to me and Dan, and we can work on that. So as I kind of mentioned on the previous slide in discussing our research, the purpose of a drought plan is kind of threefold. So the first thing it does is it sets deadlines or critical dates for making important decisions during a really stressful time. And in that way, it helps prioritize objective decision-making when decisions just have to be made. It also pairs proactive and reactive strategies to help avoid sunk costs. So what I mean by sunk costs, they can occur when you've invested in a specific proactive tool, but decide to implement a reactive tool that doesn't realize the benefit of that investment. So an example of that could be conserving forage for pregnant females, but then as a reactive decision, deciding to cull pregnant cows, just one example. The other thing that this drought decision support tool emphasizes is that flexibility is key. Flexibility in both forage demand and flexibility in supply. So one example of that, the balance between demand and supply flexibility. Demand flexibility might include adding stockers during a good forage year or selling older cows during a drought, whereas supply flexibility might include stockpiling forage during good years or seasons to save it for drier times. So part one of our plan really, or our decision support tool really deals with goal setting and taking inventory of the information that you already have available, because that information can help fill in the rest of the tool and also identify areas that you might want to collect more data in. So we have a lot of questions questions about what data you already are collecting. You can see that in the box on the right-hand side. And then some questions about goals and the current management strategies you're already using. Part 2 of the decision support tool deals with developing a forage calendar in advance so that you can identify areas where you might have gaps in your forage calendar. And our hope is that by doing that early, that you can build more flexibility into how you're going to address those gaps. So more options to pivot to depending on circumstances. Part 3 of the tool looks specifically at pairing proactive strategies and reactive strategies. So this is kind of just a starting point for what that may look like. We have strategies that speak more to supply flexibility highlighted in blue, and then strategies that speak more to having demand flexibility highlighted in yellow. So again, one example of kind of pairing proactive and reactive strategies may be if you've gone through the effort of conserving forage as a proactive strategy, it might be worth looking at the cost of hauling stock water to make use of that available forage before starting to cull replacement females. So as I mentioned, this is by no means an exhaustive list of options, but it's just a starting point to start thinking about pairing strategies and avoiding those sunk costs. And part 4 deals specifically with the economic analysis part of your plan. So once you've identified what your preferred strategies are, an economic analysis can allow you to determine how much those strategies will cost and what they will save, and allow you to kind of use that as a filter for what you'll want to implement. So we address the economic analysis piece by developing partial budgets to evaluate specific drought management strategies. So they don't necessarily show the whole picture, but those partial budgets can go a long way to helping outline the pros and cons of potential decisions before you make them. And then, of course, as a complement to the economic analysis, setting critical dates for your selected strategies and also reevaluating your plan will be really important. So the final part of the plan, part 5, deals more with that, that recovery piece and also reflection. So reevaluating what worked and what didn't work is really a vital component of a plan that supports the ranch for the long haul or supports ranch resilience. And I just wanted to bring our adaptive decision-making framework into this piece, talking about recovery and reflection, because adaptation really evolves over time as experience continues to shape each one of these components of how we manage for drought. So this is an iterative process: planning, learning, reevaluating priorities, and planning again. So that means that not getting this right the first time doesn't mean your drought plan is bad. It just means that you have ranch specific data to inform your next decision. And this gets back again to why having a written drought management plan is so important. Because during a tough drought year, that written plan can provide something objective to stick to, but over time, writing down the decisions you make and how they pan out can help you track what worked and what didn't work during a given year, and that information can help inform future planning, making your drought plan more and more tailored to your ranch and your goals over time. So I wanted to share just briefly what our drought decision support tool looks like. So I've gone over each one of these components, and I think Dan is going to drop a link to this tool in the chat, but this is basically the plan. So the first part 1, kind of taking inventory of your resources. building out your forage calendar. So this is throughout the entire year. So you've got a spot to enter information for each month. And then this final column kind of prompts you to consider the economics of your decision about how to fill any gaps you may have identified in your calendar. And here's again that table that kind of outlines how you may go about pairing proactive and reactive strategies. And then a spot for recovery and reflection there at the end. So scrolling back up to the economic decision-making piece of this forage calendar. So for the economic considerations, we do have, Dan actually developed these spreadsheets outlining partial budgets for different types of decisions you might be considering during drought. So these we'll also link these in the chat, but basically you can download these spreadsheets, and we've got a couple kind of options down here at the moment for feeding, culling, and early weaning. So there's an example column, and then also a column for you to enter your specific operation information. And the information you can kind of take away and use for decision-making is highlighted in red here. So let's see. So thinking about 2022 and where we're at in the drought currently, it's really difficult to address what next steps to take or how to plan in the middle of a multi-year drought. So I wrote down a couple notes about potential options to consider if you're in that spot right now. If you don't currently have a drought plan that you're working through, something to consider might be using these partial budgets to kind of guide your decision-making in 2022. You can also start documenting and collecting data as soon as possible, even if it's not part of a formal drought management plan. You can use all of that data to help develop a plan at a later date. And I'd also advise taking advantage of the resources that are available in your county. So talk to your FSA county director about what cost sharing opportunities might be available, what program deadlines are, what might be a good fit for your operation. And then, of course, cooperative extension is always available to help with questions or to connect you to any resources that you may need. So Dan and Leslie might have more to add to that list. But with that, I'm happy to take any questions and just want to remind everyone that we're always seeking feedback on this tool. So if you have any thoughts after our conversation today, or if you go through the tool at a later date and have something you want to add, please let Dan or I know. And my email is at the bottom of the screen here.
Great, thank you, Grace, very, very much. And while folks are thinking of questions, again, you can put questions in the Q&A pod at the bottom of your screen. But we did get a couple of email questions. One of them is, could you give us some examples of a critical date and kind of how that works?
Yeah, so a critical date can, again, help with the objectivity that's kind of required when you're making a difficult decision. So a critical date might look different for different operations, but one example would be looking at soil moisture or precipitation data and kind of setting your date based on, if I don't have enough precip or if I don't have enough soil moisture at this point during the spring, I know that that's going to leave me short on feed in these key areas of my operation. So that means I either need to start looking at options to increase my forage supply, so buying feed or leasing new pasture, or decreasing my demand by selling animals or moving animals to a different location maybe. So that would be my first thought, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that question, Dan.
Well, I think you hit the big issues. I think determining, what conditions have to be like at a particular date before you pull the trigger on a specific decision is kind of the definition of the critical date. Maybe an example for this last spring, we had established a critical date of April 1st, where if we hadn't received an inch of moisture or didn't have rain in the forecast, we were going to sell anything that hadn't lambed in our operation yet. And, you know, fortunately, we had some rain kind of the end of March and a pretty good outlook at the beginning of April. We didn't have to implement that decision. But the other thing I think a critical date does for you is it sets in motion the planning for implementing the decision. You know, you don't wake up April 1st and say, I'm hauling ewes to the sale today. You kind of think about all the steps that it takes to begin to implement that.
Mm-hmm.
Question that I get from a lot of folks, and I'm sure you do too, is when should you plan for drought, Grace? When should you start this?
Well, I think the standard extension answer is when it's raining. It's a great time to plan for drought. But I mean, really, I think there's some truth in that, because when you have, I guess, the space to walk through some of these important decisions without the stress of responding to current drought events, I think that can help inform a plan that maybe, the way I kind of mentioned, that isn't just a drought management plan, but a drought plan that's integrated into your ranch plan. And it seems like from some of the feedback we've gotten from people that integrating your typical drought plan into the ranch plan is what really helps people adapt during this time of uncertainty with drought becoming more intense and frequent and severe. So I guess ideally you would start planning at when you're not in a drought, to take some of the pressure off yourself and to provide some space to have these conversations. But I also think that anytime is a good time to start collecting data and starting the planning process. So, I mean, this year, for an example, kind of how I mentioned at the end of the presentation, taking note of the things that you've done this year and last year and how they're working for you, the results of the decisions you've already made might be a really, really good point to start at when we're out of drought, to kind of start that more in-depth planning process.
Along those lines, Grace, where can a producer go if they haven't started tracking data or tracking information about their operation? Is there, I would assume that they could come to you if they're in Siskiyou County, but are there some guides to beginning to track some of that useful data?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would definitely, Extension is a good resource, but I think a lot of the support agencies that people have in their counties provide really, really good, succinct information about how to start monitoring. So I'm thinking that your local NRCS office or your local RCD could have some really good information. So that would be a starting point for sure. What do you think, Dan? Am I missing something there?
No, I think that's definitely a starting point. I think this is on a different topic entirely, but I think heard a producer from Australia say a couple of weeks ago that when we can get to the point where we're making decisions about individual animals in the context of drought or the context of their productivity, that takes a higher level of information tracking, and there's some tools out there to help people do some of that as well, whether it's the red book that you can get from NCBA or an electronic ID system that allows you to really track productivity over time. There's some pretty good tools out there now.
One other thing that comes to mind is that I think, especially with drought planning, some of the folks I've talked to have said, I have a drought plan, but it's just not written down. So I think that a lot of people do have in mind things that work and that don't work for their specific operation. Something to consider would be just taking what you already kind of file away in your head and getting it on paper, so that over the years, it's easier to go back and look at what decisions were made, why, and what the results of those decisions were. And something that got brought up during another conversation with Drought was just transferring that information from generation to generation. It's always great to do that by having a conversation with your grandpa or your grandma, but I think it can also make it a lot easier to make sure that that information doesn't get lost by making sure that the records there's a hard copy somewhere, so that, you know, people in the future can look back on all the experiences you've had and use that to inform their decisions.
Absolutely. And that we've had the experience here of a rancher passing away unexpectedly, and nobody in the rest of the family knowing where the water shut off was, or, you know, real key points like that it's easy to keep in your head and not share.
Right.
Any other questions out there? Well, Grace, thank you. That was a really, really helpful overview of the tool and of the approach to being more proactive with drought planning. So thank you for the presentation. And again, we will post this on the YouTube channel, hopefully within the next week. That concludes our second webinar of our 2022 Working Rangelands Wednesdays Drought Series. I want to thank Dr. Roach, and especially thank Grace for a great presentation. We will be sending out a brief survey to get your feedback on the webinar. It'll take less than 2 minutes to fill out, and it really helps inform our future efforts. Our next webinar will be 2 weeks from today on July 27th. And we're going to drill a little deeper into a specific strategy on early weaning and how that might be different on annual rangeland systems than it would be in perennial systems. If you have any specific questions that you're interested in addressing in that webinar, you can email me. I'll drop my email address here in the chat if I can type and talk at the same time, which is not always possible for me. And with that, we really appreciate you being on tonight, and we look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks. Have a great evening, everybody. Thank you, Grace.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.